Each episode of Education with an Edge is meant to create, cultivate, and inspire honest discussion about issues affecting youth. Hosted by author, artist, educator, advocate, and speaker, Jaquel Lane.
Hello and welcome. This is Jaquel Lane with Education with an Edge, the podcast that is all about youth and children because every child matters, and that's what we believe. We are here with the talented Brandi Liberty all the way from New Orleans. Welcome, Brandi.
Hi, Jaquel. Thank you for having me.
I am so very grateful that you're here. And I would love just for you kind of to tell us a little bit about yourself, your background information, childhood, and then most importantly, what you do as a career.
Sure, great. So I am an enrolled member of the Iowa tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, and also a descendant of the United Homa Nation, which is here in southern Louisiana. I was born and raised in New Orleans until I was 16 years old. Spent family vacations and summers in Nebraska with my grandparents, where I learned a lot of the beginnings of my Native heritage. I always knew I was Native. I understood what that meant very early on, but I wasn't necessarily ingrained in the culture and the practices because I didn't live near or on a reservation. However, growing up in New Orleans, I lived amid so many different races and religions and sexual orientations and, just cultural aspects and stuff like that. I felt very well-rounded as a well-rounded individual and, understood that there were so many amazing differences, out there in the world, and that I got to experience so many wonderful things growing up here. When I was 16, my dad and mom moved us to a small town in Nebraska, Rouleau, Nebraska.
Oh, wow.
So I went from a town here, to New Orleans, to a town of 200 people where I related to most of them.
A little bit of a culture shock.
Definitely a culture shock in so many ways, because at that time, this was over 25 years ago, there was only one race there for the most part.
Yes.
There was, obviously a lot of the Native Americans nearby from the reservations, lived on the reservation. And natives were the really only minority at the time. We didn't have African Americans and Hispanics and Asians in the small town at that time,
sure.
Like we do now, which is crazy to me. That just 25 years later, that they're getting
it's
an
become
influx
that
of
diverse, yeah.
Yes,
which is wonderful.
For me, it just sounds weird to say there was no diversity there when I
you were
first moved to
up.
Nebraska, right? I graduated high school from there, 2 years later, a small Catholic school there in Falls City, Nebraska. And I went on to the University of Nebraska in Lincoln.
Whoop, whoop.
So go Big Red. Where I majored in history with an emphasis in Native American studies and ethnic studies. I received a BA in arts there. Following my undergrad, I went on to the University of Kansas. I am not a Jayhawks fan. I will always be a Huskers fan.
Oh, we love you.
Even before LSU growing up here. And I hold a Master of Arts from the Center of Indigenous Nation Studies there at KU, where I focused on tribal human resources.
Wow.
That was kind of something that just kind of fell in my lap. It wasn't something, I'd sought out to do. And because of that, today I am the owner of Hurrdat Media Consulting, which is Iowa for Morningstar Consulting, which provides tribal consulting services to Native American tribes, tribal businesses, some nonprofit organizations. And I have over 10 years of experience working in Indian country, just in a variety of different topics, doing grant writing, grant management, teaching, policy development, you name it, I cover it. At the same time, I'm also the chapter administrator for the National Cervical Cancer Coalition's New Orleans chapter.
Oh my goodness. And so, with a resume like that, I just have obviously just the utmost respect for you, but it's phenomenal that one person can juggle all of those. And
then I also have two children.
Yes, two beautiful children. I was going to say that
single
too.
Mom, yep, single
rock star mom.
One child on a spectrum, the other also with ADHD. So they also keep me very busy and well as all of this.
No, that's phenomenal. And even more phenomenal that just you are there to be such a light and a sounding board to get advocacy for these organizations and Native Americans. I think that's absolutely phenomenal. And so at Education with an Edge, Brandi, we kind of like to focus on obviously children and different, looking at different career paths and things like that. But also looking back on our own childhoods and seeing, who made an influence or who made a difference in our lives at a pivotal time. So looking back on your own childhood, what memory, what did you dream of becoming when you grew up and why? Or do you remember?
Well, I always wanted to be either an attorney or a history teacher.
Very cool. Powerhouse.
Yes. Those were my things. On the side, I kind of secretly wanted to also be a hairdresser, but knew I was going to go on, and do other things as well. I still wish today I had that little hairdresser background.
Me too, right? It would make life a lot easier. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And so when I started graduate school, actually, I started with the intent of getting a dual law degree at the same time. But very early on in my graduate school career, I realized I could focus on interpreting the law through human resources work, which I had already been doing, as employment through undergrad and just that first year of graduate school. And so I kind of nixed the idea of going to law school. And, today, because I do a lot of work in Indian country, I do a lot of, citing of federal regulations.
Yes.
I do a lot of teaching. I teach a lot of tribes on a variety of different topics, including federal regulations and federal Indian law related topics. I do HR work for Native Americans. And so I feel like I've gotten the best of both worlds without having to go on and getting that law degree or getting that history teaching degree. But I still do all of those things, in my daily work professional environment.
Day-to-day life. Absolutely.
Yes.
And, we ran through so many of your involvements, but one of them that, one of the very many hats that you wear, and you are such an accomplished woman, is that you are the New Orleans leader at the NCCC, or National Cervical Cancer Coalition. What is your reasoning or your passion behind that, behind this disease, and what does it mean to you to be a part of that?
Well, in 2017, my dear friend, at the age of 35, was told that she only had a few months to live after being diagnosed with cervical cancer a few months prior. She had one important wish as she fought through her battle with cervical cancer, and it was to continue her legacy by advocating and educating everyone on cervical cancer.
Yes.
There's a lot of information out there on ovarian cancer and other, female-related cancers, but cervical cancer oftentimes isn't fatal. It's caught early on. And for those that it is, becomes a fatal disease, there's not a lot of resources out there to either educate yourself or for family members and things like that to find resources.
Or for young women as well.
Yes,
yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
Absolutely.
And, her and I talked a lot on her bedside, on how, not only do we not see this just in the general public, but, specifically, I know in Indian country, and working with different Indian health services, it's not an area that's necessarily focused on as a whole. We all miss, our Michelle dearly and everything. I think you knew her as well.
Yes. Lovely, wonderful person.
And, but I felt, fulfilling her legacy was one way to continue, to let her live on. And just a few short months after she passed away, I became the chapter administrator for that New Orleans chapter. I reached out to the National Cervical Cancer Coalition, found out that they did not have a chapter here in New Orleans. And I started kind of becoming an activist, here
Absolutely.
with developing, trying to raise money and things like that. Their mission is to help women and family members and caregivers battle the personal issues that are related to cervical cancer and HPV. And then also to advocate for cervical health in all women by promoting prevention through education, and also about early vaccinations, PAP testing, HPV testing, when recommended, and all of those things.
Absolutely, which are also vital and important to survival, right?
Exactly.
So thank you for doing that. That's phenomenal. So you are also the owner and tribal consultant at Morningstar Consulting. So can you tell our audience a little bit about this and what you want people to know about Morningstar?
Yes. So as I mentioned when I introduced myself, I'm the owner of Morningstar Consultant. I've owned that organization for over 10 years now. And I provide tribal consulting services to Native American tribes and tribal businesses. My initial experience started with just writing grants for my own tribe. And from there, over the years, it's kind of grown into, more having specialized services where I go out and do training and technical assistance on a variety of topics, from things from customer service all the way up to federal regulations. I still continue to do grant writing today. That's one of the areas I really enjoy, especially focusing in Indian housing. I also, work directly with tribal governments. I have, right now, I'm also the program administrator for my own tribes, Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska's tribal justice strategic planning grant, where I am working with the different tribal justice entities of our tribe, so the courts, domestic violence program, substance abuse program, those things, where I am helping to develop a strategic plan for those each of those programs to grow and receive federal funding for future projects,
which are so imperative and essential. For the success of these people. And you touched on the fact that I want to talk about your time as Ponca Housing Authority and some of the issues that you face with that. But I also, I think that our listeners would love to hear about. We often hear from afar about the issues facing American Indians today. But this is such a personal issue to you. Can you elaborate on some of the current problems on the reservations and how you are working to help them?
Yes. So, first and foremost, my expertise is being a subject matter expert in a lot of the Indian housing programs. HUD, I work directly with HUD very often on writing grant applications, going out and doing that training and technical assistance, because Indian housing is one area where, I feel affects all Native Americans, whether they are utilizing their individual tribes' housing authorities, or whether they're living in their own homes or living in urban, or rural areas. There's just a common, I feel like, denominator there, where majority of Native Americans are still living in absolute poverty, no matter where they live.
Yes.
It's difficult for them to get housing because of some of the other issues that are out there. It's difficult for employment, and that if you're living on the reservation, we already know what unemployment is like just out here in urban and rural America. But then you add in the reservation aspect that has very little economic development. Unemployment becomes a challenge, and obviously, in order to have places to live, you need money.
Yes.
And so, a lot of Native Americans still live in either overcrowded or what HUD considers homeless conditions. We kind of see those individuals. It's not those that we see in the city aspect where you're, living in a tent under the bridge. It's more of the crowd surfing, where you have many large families living in one house. So that's overcrowded. And then on top of that, some of those individuals may have initially had their own home, but have to basically couch surf from relative to relative.
Sure.
And so we kind of see that as, as homelessness. They don't have their own place to go to. And so, obviously those just immediate issues with unemployment and homelessness and overcrowding definitely, expand to some of the other current problems we see with alcoholism and mental health and violence against women and all of those things. It becomes a cycle effect, in one way, shape, or form.
Yes. And thank you for sharing that, because our listeners need to know what American Indians are facing right now. Since Education with an Edge is geared towards youth and at-risk youth specifically, who we would like to listen to this podcast and something would click and it would help them to either motivate them or turn their lives around. Mm-hmm. What do you see young American Indians being faced with, and what are some programs that are in place to help them succeed?
I think the first, a lot of those Native American youth that are living off the reservation, that are growing up in urban areas like myself and things like that, often they generally do well as far as, taking the steps to, when they graduate high school to go on to college and things like that. And oftentimes, if they have grown up being ingrained within their culture and stuff, they do things to give back to their communities or other, Indian communities. But those that are living on the reservation, there are so many different challenges as far as, not getting a good education, schools either being closed, not having schools nearby, needing to commute into, some of the maybe mostly rural areas to go to those schools. There's not a lot of programs in place for youth a lot of times. A lot of the substance abuse programs or domestic violence programs are going to focus more on those adult individuals or, families components, but not, there may be some boys and girls clubs and things like that. But juvenile delinquency becomes very rampant in a lot of reservation areas. And I've seen that, within some of the reservations there in Nebraska and even, just across Indian country as a whole. There are some programs there that, as far as tribes giving out scholarships for those individuals that want to go on to college and things like that. But again, there's those challenges of finding, the resources outside of scholarships and things like that. There's often this myth out there that, oh, you're Indian, you get to go to college for free.
Exactly.
I can tell you, I sure as in heck did not go to college for free. And I will be probably paying on college for the rest of my life.
Like the rest, yeah.
I have, within my program that I went to graduate school for, primarily most of us were Native American. I can name on one hand the number of students that came from more prosperous and economically developed tribes that did kind of cover college education cost. But everybody else, most people go to grad school and you only focus on school. Most of us had to work full time, go to school full time, and those sorts of things, and have student loans out of our ears,
like the rest of America, right? Just
crazy. Exactly.
I'm so glad that you touched on that. Because that's
and
a
so
huge
being able to, as a Native youth, finding a niche for yourself and assisting your communities on developing programs and things like that. If you feel that, juvenile delinquency is being a problem, reach out to your tribal council and say, hey, let's build a basketball court. Do you have the funds for this? Or how can we help find grant money to build a basketball court to give us something to do versus going and stealing cars or, smoking weed or, those sorts of things. And so, the youth, at this point, I feel they're, just being educated, educating themselves, I think is important on what they can do to help their communities.
Absolutely. And then making the right connections so that they can find the resources that are available.
And then being peer mentors for those younger ones that aren't quite there yet so that they can kind of learn. That's really the only way to start changing the cycle is, it's got to start somewhere. A lot of tribes right now, we still have a lot of what we consider elders. There's still 2 and 3 generations ahead of us still alive and working and running, these Native American tribes. And a lot of them are still set in their old ways. And so it is up to our youth, those high schoolers and, those in their 20s and just going through college to really help make those changes within, the tribal populations to grow and prosper and, become more youth focused versus just economic development and farming and, those sorts of things.
Yes. No, very, very good points on all accounts. So I always like to throw this question in here, and I never want to throw my guests off, but you're so awesome. So once again, we're here to inspire youth and community members. If someone were to ask you what you wanted your legacy to be, what would you say?
Oh, goodness.
It's like that heavy hitter. It's like coming out strong.
Yes. I always, I can always speak to, my grandmother was a very much a leader within our tribe and within our community there in Rouleau, Nebraska. I was lucky enough to have known her growing up. I mean, my dad is the youngest of 6 boys, youngest with a 10-year difference between the two. So between the second and the first, him, all of my cousins are my parents' age. And so, they grew up with her in the same way as my dad did, being very ingrained in the tribe, once I was born, she was elderly then. And, she would make us Indian dresses and things like that. And I would hear the stories of the things she used to do within the community. One thing in Rouleau, there was an old Catholic church, and in front of it was the pig pen for the town.
Oh, wow.
Where everyone raised their, where the hogs were being raised for the church and things like that. And she realized, okay, these youth are going crazy. We need to do something for them. And she solicited the Catholic Church and the community to give funds and turn that pig pen into a playground.
Oh my gosh.
And so a lot of what she did was definitely very youth focused. A lot of people will like to say that she made you work hard. She was definitely a micromanager. My dad spent many summers mowing the Catholic cemetery up the street. You can ask anyone probably age 55 and up in that small town, what do you know of Ethel Liberty? And they will have some story of how she sent them to do some job that, as they would put it, that she didn't want to do.
She was a doer. Yeah.
And so, I do what I do to help live out her legacy. I feel like, I feel like my expertise is, very, individualized, I guess you can say. I've kind of built my career on my own. I don't know anybody else that does exactly what I do. I know Native grant writers, I know Native teachers, but the all encompassing,
you do everything.
Very far and few between. And, I think, for me, I feel like my legacy needs to be to carry on basically the same legacy as my grandmother. She wanted someone to be able to carry on what she did. I'm the one in the family that's doing that now, and I can only hope that my children or my kids' kids will, do something of the same.
Well, that is a legacy in and of itself. And they have a phenomenal superwoman of a mother to look up to. So I'm sure that they will. Brandi, we are so grateful that you are able to join us here today on Education with an Edge. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, Brandi Liberty of Morning Star Consultants. And I'm going to let Brandi give a shout out on her social media and where you can find her. So, Brandi, would you just like to tell our audience where they can find you on Facebook?
Yes. I have a Facebook page. If you Google or go on Facebook and look up Morning Star Consulting, you'll see me there with my in my regalia and my logo and all of that. You can also find me through my website, HurrdatBikacheConsulting.com. I will spell that out. It's HurrdatBikaxe Consulting.com. You can also find me on LinkedIn as Brandi Liberty.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Brandi, and keep doing what you're doing. You're such a bright, shining light in not just your community, but throughout the United States for Indian rights. So thank you so much. And thank you for being with us here today on Education with an Edge. Remember, we are the podcast that only cares about youth, communities, and families because we believe that every child matters and you should too. Thank you.
If you have a question or just want to learn more, go to JaquelLane.com. Thanks for listening to Education with an Edge.
A Parkville Media Production.